Okay, I think we can now start since it's being live streamed. Without
Yep,
any
alright.
further ado, call upon the Prime Minister to open the debate.
All right, great. Can everyone hear me?
Yep.
Okay, let me just pull up my timer. All right. In many post-conflict states, we say that nationalism was often the drug that sparked conflicts in the first place. In order to begin the project of post-conflict healing, we stand in proud proposition of the idea that post-conflict states should not encourage nationalism. Briefly on the model, we define nationalism as an often excessive devotion or love for nation. This often looks like teaching history in a way that makes the country look good, having pledges of allegiance and lionizing national identity, and more often than not, stigmatizing criticism of the country. We think that we'll have to defend this higher burden of nationalism rather than the lower burden of just liking your country, because we think this is an extremely low bar for what nationalism looks like and is unlikely to bring any of the benefits that opposition as a whole probably stands for. As an alternative, we support a focus on community, loving the people around you generally, just not a devotion to the actual idea abstractly of a national identity or the country. We have 3 points then. First, on cultural erasure. I think important context here is that nations are socially constructed, and the ways that countries define their national history and identity is far from objective. And often we argue that the national identity that is taught, in order for it to have any meaning beyond we are one country, is often the identity and history of the majority group within the country, because that majority group has access to power, controls education, controls media, and controls generally what is taught. So for example, American culture tends to generally just be white culture. And often to portray your nation as united, you have to undercut or ignore the fact that indigenous people were there in the first place and were colonized, and that people in fact existed in that area before there was your country. So often we think to truly instill what this national identity means is to push for minority and tribal cultures to, at the very best, be swept under the rug and stigmatized in order to, implement a national identity that actually has any meaning, or that actually, imposes the majority culture in most instances. And we think in the very worst case, far from just being swept under the rug or stigmatized, these nations altogether prohibit these cultures from being displayed. So for example, the fact that Black people in the United States can be denied employment for wearing Black hairstyles, or the fact that Native American children were forced to stop speaking their language and go to boarding schools and unlearn their culture, we think that is the very worst of what nationalism and national identity looks like. And we think for there to really even be a national identity that has any meaning, it often has to be the case that these majority cultures are enforced in the first place. And further, we think a key component of what it means to push nationalism is often historical revisionism. So you need to portray the country as being great, and that means you need to sanitize the fact that there was a conflict, that people were literally killing each other just years ago. That's why Rwanda made it illegal to say the words Hutu and Tutsi immediately following the conflict, and why Japan refuses to acknowledge their use of Korean comfort women post-war. The impact of this is that there's an erasure of critical history that is necessary for reckoning and post-conflict healing, and I'll talk more on this later, and it takes away the cultures and minorities, which is more likely to spike or to ignite post-conflict conflicts later, which we'll talk about more later as well. And further, I think it just leads minorities to devalue their faith in the educational system. So minority parents will just tell their kids to take everything with a grain of salt, which makes the nationalist project much difficult. Our second argument is that it makes nation building and national healing more difficult, which is arguably the most important thing in a post-conflict state. Recognize that many of these conflicts started because of intense nationalism, right? So for example, the Rohingya genocide in Myanmar started with an intense nationalism that claimed these people are not nationally Myanmar, they are from Bangladesh, right? Or the fact that in Germany, people said Jews are not actually German, we must extinguish them from the country. And I think there's a danger that this kind of nationalism will not be the good kind, especially because in many cases, the history of the post-conflict state was literally that nationalism was weaponized to spark the conflict in the very first place. And as we pointed out, this nationalism is likely to exclude minorities. So there's a good chance that it just reignites the fighting and the conflict. But even if we get the good kind of national identity in this case, here's some reasons why it's still bad. First, because it's harder to reckon with the wrongs that have been done, for example, in a civil or ethnic conflict, because when you're constructing a nationalist narrative, as we mentioned earlier, these disagreements are considered divisive. So for example, if you're teaching students that you're one great nation, you have to necessarily downplay the fact that one group of people was being murdered by another just a year ago. And this narrative itself ends up being divisive because it's necessarily glosses over and erases real differences and conflicts, no thank you, between people. People who are victims or who lost out or whose narratives are being erased will feel that they probably are what is being taught won't include them. And secondly, we think that nationalism means devotion to country, meaning that any kind of disagreement or criticism of a government is seen as unpatriotic, which creates a chilling effect that in these often nascent democracies or semi-democracies. That's important because public pressure and accountability is needed to keep leaders honest, but when leaders can weaponize nationalism to demonize their critics, corruption and authoritarianism can thrive. The impact of this is that there's corruption, backsliding into authoritarianism, ethnic conflict when these flames are fanned, and it just makes it difficult to enact the policies that help people that were hurt by the conflict in the first place. I'll take closing opposition if you have one. Opening opposition.
Please tell us why education systems are not the best place to push nationalistic values, because you haven't done that analysis.
I mean, I think that you have, like, in general, all the things that I told you, right? Like, you're likely to teach history in a way that is really revisionist. Your teachers are likely to be white. The people who determine, or like, you know, of the majority culture, the people who determine what it is that will be taught are often like very influential members of the majority group. So you're likely to like radicalize children very early on. And we think that that has trickle down effects because the things that you learn early on are the things that you tend to believe going forward. We think that's really bad. Like, all of these harms of nationalism are obviously really bad when you're teaching them to young, impressionable children who carry these views with them for life. And I think that, you know, to the extent that we don't do that and we do the alternative thing that we suggested, which is, you know, a focus on community, loving people around you, you're likely to get better outcomes. Great. All right. So that in general are some reasons why we think that the project will be bad for internal healing and is likely to spark divisiveness. Now we're going to talk a little bit about why this makes international relations or cooperation with other countries less likely. I think, first of all, national identity in these cases is often formed in opposition to something else, whether this is intended or not, right? Because extreme devotion to your nation makes it more likely that you view people outside of the group as other and untrustworthy, right? So even if your national identity is not constructed in opposition to minority groups or indigenous groups, it's likely to be constructed in opposition to other countries around you. What does this mean? We think, first of all, it means that leaders are likely to take advantage of this to blame other countries for their failings, which is another reason this can create uncritical citizens and an unaccountable government. And this is particularly true when impressionable young children learn these values early on, and it becomes much harder to unlearn them because you take your education, your teachers to be objective. But it also means that you're less likely to cooperate with other countries, distrust international institutions, because you have the fear that they want to integrate you into a larger group, and your focus necessarily is on the nation. The impact of this is that you get less international buy-in, which is really important because A, you need to avoid, you know, invasion and external conflict trivially to maintain the post-conflict state, but B, because you need to, like, you know, establish trade partnerships and gain foreign direct investment, which is critical to maintaining the country and preventing blacksliding, given that economic woes are often, in many cases, what re-spark ethnic conflicts because people, you know, blame other ethnic groups for economic problems. For all of these reasons, because we believe nationalism is so pernicious within these countries, we're incredibly proud to propose.
That speaker for their speech and call upon the leader of the opposition to open the case for OO.
Okay, so can you hear me?
Yeah, you're good.
I'll start in 3, 2, 1. Nationalism at its core is about organic change. What this means is that we achieve nationalistic values through a multitude of things. Firstly, through voting. Secondly, through media. And thirdly, through curricula. This debate is about us questioning whether curricula is the best position to achieve or promote nationalistic values. We tell you that in this debate, opening government loses dismally because they didn't speak about why education system is the best way to push this. If anything, they haven't even been sincere to the motion because they need to tell us why not through the education system. What is it about the education system that we can't push nationalistic values? Contrastively, what we're going to do is that we want to tell you that it is the best position to push and it's the best place to instill nationalistic values because this is where we get all these different minorities that opening government speaks about in one classroom and we're able to push what is best for that particular country. We think that there's poor analysis from OG. Secondly, we're going to show you why this is the most effective place as well to push these narratives because we think that in a position where individuals are there to learn, individuals are there to make mistakes, that is the best placed position for people to understand their identity and their national identity. And lastly, we're going to show you the significance of the education system, because in addition to it being about learning and making mistakes, it's also about instilling cultural and important nationalistic values that are going to carry them for life. And we think that it is important that for governments to invest in these kind of programs, especially within curricula, right? The few issues of responses, right? Firstly, they tell you that the alternative to what they push as opening government is for communities-based projects. We tell you that is what is happening, that we can move on from that. We think that we need to also be creative about how we instill policies that protect the state and protect the country. Secondly, they tell you that there's cultural erasure because majority of the group will be the one that will be pushed in the nationalistic value. We say you this is a lie, because South Africa, for example, is a one diverse country with 11 official languages, over 12 different cultural practices, but the nationalistic identity is not one that is dominant through one ethnistic value. We think that they needed to do analysis to show us how does the nationalistic value or the cultural identity become the national identity to the point where that is one that is pushed conservative, mostly within education curricula. We think that that's poor analysis from OG, right? Secondly, they tell you that no, national it affects international relations, right? And they tell you that the reason for this is that it's always used as a response to some sort of conflict within the state. And you tell you that's the real reason why we push nationalistic values in the first place, to fight off narratives that were pushed area that were oppressive. We speak about apartheid, South Africa, we speak about Zimbabwe and colonization, we speak about many African states undergoing colonization in order to be able to fight off that colonial legacy. They had to become a nationalistic value in order to respond and gain their independence. We think that what opening government in today's debate, they haven't given us framing whatsoever to understand and what forms of nationalistic values and what they look like, to a point that we reject them within educational instances, right? A few issues of analysis I'm going to give from OO. First, I'm going to characterize post-conflict states and why we need to understand why post-conflict states are in the best position to implement nationalistic values through education. Firstly, these are states that look to seek for social cohesion. This means that states like South Africa, where white people have shown us power as blacks in South Africa, we need to call them to account and be able to social cohere. But what we did, even in the Mandela era, is that we didn't throw white people out or throw blue people out because we thought that they treated us badly. What we did is that we pushed for what we call the rainbow nation in South Africa, that we all can coexist in the same places. How this was achieved was through curricula, where we got to learn about Nelson Mandela, where we go to learn about Nelson Mandela's exile in Robben Island, so that historical importance becomes important in a debate like this one through educational values. And we think that governments need to set up that debate. Secondly, is that we implement democratic values and practices, right? We think that these values and practices of democracy, of accountability, transparency, participation, and understanding of each other in our different multitude exist in spaces like media, exist in spaces like language, but additionally exist in spaces like curricula, and where curricula is drawn up to set up and represent the individuals in that particular state. We think that this motion speaks to that kind of setup where it's possible to teach individuals that we're all South Africans, even if they are whites, blacks, Indians, and other POCs that exist in the country. We think that that value is one that can be imparted and instilled only through education, because we think that media is very optional. We think that language is also very optional. But when we speak about education and the education system, it's something that becomes compulsory, where you need to get certain credits when you learn about your historical form of national building. We think that's particularly important, right? The second idea that I want to push is the idea of why education system, right? And here the simple analysis here is the room to learn and make mistakes, right? We think that it is only through education where individuals are able to make mistakes and learn through their mistakes, right? This is how to treat, for example, people from minority groups, as OG might argue, or how to treat individuals who exist from different ethnic groups in diverse post-conflict states. We think that the only way is that individuals make mistakes in a space that allows for those individuals to make mistakes. But secondly, allows for those individuals to be taught about that nationalistic value and how to treat other individuals that are diverse within that particular culture, right? The third analysis that I want to push is the analysis of, before I do, let me maybe take a POI quickly. Okay.
Yes. So I guess, you're talking about instilling like pro-democratic values, but isn't this just a pro-democratic value and not necessarily a national identity within the classroom?
No, you are missing my analysis because it is a nationalistic value, because what the one thing that we realize, and I gave you about the context of post-conflict states, are ones that post social cohesion. Even if that social cohesion looks like democratic values, if that social cohesion looks about nationalistic identities which make part of democratic values, is something that we think that can be pushed throughout an education system. You still haven't showed us the harm with pushing it through the education system. The last idea that I want to push to you is the idea of decolonization, and why decolonization is important: to unlearn those colonialistic values, to unlearn those values that were instilled through us through the boat by individuals who came and colonized those our states in that regard. The only best way to do that is through the education system, to depict colonialists as colonialists, to depict individuals as individuals who've taken over countries, and to push a nationalistic value in which individuals opt into at the end of the day. And we've shown you holistically by far that it only works best through the education system as opposed to language and media. And we think that we are not devaluing the other forms in which it exists in, but it also exists best in other forms that such as curricula, right? The last idea, and the one idea that Atlehang will also push, is why it is important, especially for formidable years, because in the education system is this where you get individuals in their formidable years, in their years of still learning and adapting to understanding nationalistic values, right? At the end of the day, we've shown you that this education is the best place to instill these nationalistic values. But secondly, we show that it was most effective in those instances. Even if we don't win this debate, we believe that this is an interesting case that we've ran. We are proud to oppose. Thank you.
I thank that speaker for their speech, and now for the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the case for Gov Bench.
Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay. 1 second. Okay. So I think the main problem with opening opposition is that their case rests on the basic assumption that nationalism is a good thing, and we should have this debate about what is the best way to instill nationalism in a population, whether that's through, like, I don't know, encouraging voting, through the educational system, through dropping leaflets to people's houses from a helicopter, whatever. But what our case actually proved from Danielle, and what wasn't fully engaged with, is that we showed that nationalism is bad and should not be instilled through any means. In particular, we showed some of the specific harms of doing so through the educational system. I think it's really important first to kind of have a clear idea of what nationalism is, which we did lay out in the OG case, but I think there's kind of a moving target in the leader of the opposition about what nationalism even is. Because on OG, we're happy to defend things like devotion to democratic institutions and civic culture and participation, but those are not the same thing as nationalism, because nationalism is about glorifying the country, not about glorifying the system of democracy, participation, accountability, and things like that. So we would happily teach civic culture and participation in our schools, but we would not teach devotion to the construct of the nation, which is, as we say, mostly an imaginary thing that papers over, actual real differences between individuals. So in this speech, what I'm going to do is first talk about our case, which wasn't super engaged with, and why I think our points still stand, responding to some of those rebuttals. And second, I will kind of take opening opposition at their best and show why, maybe the classroom in education isn't the place to do this if you do want to push nationalism. So first, let's talk about culture. So we get a response from opening opposition that basically says, it's a little bit, oversimplified to say that when you have a national identity, it's just the majority culture and it's pushed on everyone. There's things like the Rainbow Nation, which include diversity and lots of different groups of people. And that's certainly true. The point that we're making is, in order to have a national identity with any substance, it has to be to some extent one size fits all. So it's certainly true that you can take little different things from different cultures and craft them into a national identity, but we still think that that one size fits all culture, which is, as the motion requires, imposed on people from the top down, is likely to be coercive and harmful. To the extent that you take that you do take things from other cultures and include them, they're likely to be sort of a two-dimensional version that probably doesn't respect the original context and origin of that culture. So doing so could actually be actively harmful in an attempt to include minority groups. But even if that's not true, to the extent to which this is a one-size-fits-all thing that's pushed on people, there will be parts of minorities' cultures that are included in this broader narrative and parts that won't be. And given that it's still imposed in the classroom and has to be, put onto people, it's not really organic because it's being forced on people through the education system, we still think most of the harms that we talked about in our case are true, which is that if you're trying to express some kind of thing that wasn't approved as part of this national, culture, whether that's a certain piece of clothing, a religious practice, a hairstyle, anything like that, those things will often be forcibly sanitized, removed from the classroom because they are seen as divisive. And more importantly, under this point, we talked about, and this just wasn't engaged with at all, that building this national identity requires papering over real differences and real conflicts between people, which constitutes a form of historical erasure, which is to say, talking about the war that happened a few years ago, or talking about group identity or tribal identity at all, is a part of understanding real, true, accurate history of a nation, and in many cases, preventing these kind of conflicts again. But given that those discussions are seen as in conflict with the nationalist narrative, they often just are either skimmed over or not talked about at all. And we think that's really harmful. One of the harms of it, which wasn't engaged with, is the way that it can breed distrust in the educational system as a whole. And I think that engages with opening opposition's point about should this be done in schools? On their side of the house, you're going to get parents telling their kids, well, they're not telling you the whole story. Don't trust your history teacher. They're just trying to paint this nationalist narrative, but it isn't true. So not only are you going to get the harms of cultural erasure, but also the harms of people just losing faith in the institutions, specifically at the education system. The second harm we talked about that basically wasn't engaged with at all is the harms of conflating the nation and the government, and the idea that criticizing the government is unpatriotic. And that's kind of a natural consequence of nationalism. Not only can it reignite conflict and it fails to recognize the harms, but it's really easy for leaders, especially leaders in countries with weak institutions, and there often are weak institutions in the wake of conflicts. Those leaders who, they're leaders, like power breeds corruption. When people have opportunities to take power, they will take it, which is why having a citizenry that's skeptical and holds its government accountable is so important. But when nationalism is pushed on people through the educational system, if that is successful, then criticism of the government is conflated with criticism of the nation and to demonize its critics. And that creates a chilling effect on speech and on criticism of the government, and even often of the kind of civic culture that the opening opposition wants to promote. And moreover, it allows leaders to blame other countries because of this us-them dichotomy that exists in the concept of constructing national identity. Because you share this nation with the people inside the borders, you don't share it with the people outside the borders. And that's the wrong kind of way to view humanity, and it makes it very possible to do things like backslide into authoritarianism. So you might demonize people outside the country, you might demonize the minority group inside the country, and both of those are really bad. The final thing to talk about is international relations. And I think this is where, opening opposition has the most offense, because they have this worry, which I think is correct, that, often blind trust in international institutions can be harmful. These are the same people who, often colonize countries and maybe even caused the conflicts in the first place. I would just say that this can often go too far, and nationalism is a way that it can go too far, because it can be simplistic to only view international institutions and international aid, the IMF, loans, trade, as something that is aimed at destroying the country. I think citizens should be able to look at these things through an objective lens, and they often aren't if other countries are able to be demonized. And you can see, historically, the way that countries will blame these colonial Western institutions for problems that are actually, in some cases, caused by the leader to avoid accountability. So it's better for people in a country to be able to, see those things through an objective lens and not always have this us good, other countries bad. We also talked about how this makes it less likely that conflict will happen. We think that's very good. We are proud to propose.
I thank that speaker for their speech and call upon the Deputy Leader of the Opposition to close the top half of the debate.
Just 2 seconds. I just need to take out my timer. I'll start soon. Can you hear me and see me?
Yep.
Okay, cool. I'm going to start in 3, 2, 1, go. We say for shame to international relations if it means that we have to forgo the South African history or the history of the African continent through colonialism by simply simply introducing the French Revolution to the education system. Basically, what they're saying is that their biggest fear is that we're creating a very monolithic, but rather we're trying to force individuals into learning about the history that they don't want. If anything, throughout the education system in Rwanda, in South Africa, or in many other African states post-conflict, they've been forced to read about like the French Revolution to maintain the very same international relations, which simply means two things. Firstly, you're erasing the entire history of that country or the continent. But the second thing is that you are denying children the ability to learn about history in their own formidable years. And we say for shame for international relations if it means that we have to defend a world where kids ought to learn about their own history. Just a couple of things that I need to respond to. The first argumentation that they say is that nationalism is one that is very monolithic. It says that we're saying that one size fits all. We're saying that individuals understand the different languages, the different tribes that they come from, but the one commonality or uniformity that they exist in is that post-conflict, the social cohesion is important. And the one size fits all, it's largely very important because post-conflict, it simply means that you're trying to give individuals compassion and you're trying to make them understand how a community-orientated like kind of setting is far more important as opposed to consistently trying to want individuals to exist in isolation. Even if it means that going to a white school and having to like exist with white kids and saying that it's one size fits all, we think at the end of the day, the idea of Rainbow Nation has been one that has been largely based on the principles of trying to ensure that individuals understand that even in their differences, there's one commonality, which is their own history. And we think if anything, it's important for those students to learn about the same history in the same history class. We think that this is something that's important, and this is a case that we're willing to defend. We think that you can't necessarily say that you don't want one size fits all without giving us the basis or the framing to which why education isn't necessarily the best tool to implement this kind of a situation. So the other thing that I also want to respond to is the idea of like the historical value, the fact that we're trying to radicalize the students. We say for shame, we say if anything, we allow for that specific world to exist. Because in radicalizing students, it means that you're actively allowing them to challenge the education system that for the longest time, they've also been told about the French Revolution or any other revolution without necessarily learning about their history. Why this is something that's largely important. Firstly, we think the conversation also about the fees must fall, where students in South Africa largely decided that they want to decolonize the entire system, where they have been whitewashed and told that the history in Belgium is far more important than the history in South Africa. We think this actually sparked a very important conversation about what the education system teaches the students, because largely what happens is that they're only told in 2 chapters about like the South African history and the full-on chapter about like the United States or like about the French Revolution, which we think is largely unfair because you raise the history and you even do not necessarily allow them to learn about the existence of minority individuals, even the history itself. Why Mfumo's case is important and why opposition's case is something that's important. Firstly, we tell you that in instances where you instill this in the education system, you thoroughly force them to engage the fact that the existence of minority groups is something that's very important. We've seen this happen even when individuals are forced to allow for like queer theory, even in history, where even in those instances, individuals have come to terms with the fact that the existence of Black queer individuals is something that existed in the past, which by no means when individuals do not force to learn about that specific history, they wouldn't have known about this. This is something that's very important of 2 things, because we think firstly, even with regards to historical value and you're trying to sanitize that specific history, it's very important to confront the very discomfort about that specific history where individuals are able to learn about their history full on without any sort of restrictions whatsoever. The second other important idea that you need to understand is that opening government is not sincere to the motion, because the only thing that they're saying is that nationalism is not important, but they're not necessarily justifying why nationalism isn't as important as something that we shouldn't necessarily allow. Even when we're trying to create like compassion and a community-related kind of education system, we still think that it's important for us to also allow for those individuals to learn about their history. Because the basic consumption that they have is that we're allowing for the majority to dominate or to dominate the history. We say for shame in countries like South Africa, which is largely the biggest problem, is that the minority white people dominate or own that specific history. And this is why we think that it's important for us to go full on within the education system and try to radicalize the education system and try to educate kids about their own history and the existence of minority individuals. This largely also ties to my own extension to what Mfumo gave into this debate, which is why it's important in the formidable years to teach students about their own history, or to incorporate this into the history lesson. The first part about this is that we think that this is something that's very important, because in the formidable years, it means that everything is socially constructed for you. So you're able to take in everything that you are being taught. So it simply means that in instances where we're able to teach them about their own history, or we're able to incorporate it into like the education system, it means a child as young as 2 years old in a post-conflict state, or a child as young as like 10 in high school is able to learn about their own history. Why this is something that's very important? Because firstly, we think for the longest time, when these kids go to when we go to white schools, we're like whitewashed most of the time. We're not even taught about our own history to the full on, because it's very uncomfortable for white people to be teaching that specific history. In instances where you're able to make this a prerequisite and you're able to force this to be incorporated into the education system, not only are you allowing them to learn about the conflicts that happen in their own state, but you're also able to allow them to engage in a post-conflict stage where they are now able to build on social cohesion. But before I continue, I'm going to allow closing government to give me a POI.
Okay, so you talk about the cases of nationalism that are likely to be positive. Why do you think this is the likely case scenario within post-conflict states?
Okay, so we think that we have explored like many different ways to instill nationalism, and we're still not taking away from the fact that you can instill nationalism in many different ways. However, what we're simply trying to do is that we're trying to create access into the nationalism and how individuals are ought to uphold those principles of nationalism. We're even proud to defend a world in which this is taught through the education system, because we think the education system is largely very important, where we'll still even allow for those different individuals to exist in one space and to understand that even in their differences, and because they come from different tribes, they come from different races, it still doesn't take away from the fact that they exist as one in the same state. So we think that this is something that's very important, and the analysis that you missed from Mfumo's case, because Mfumo spends his entire case trying to justify to you why this is something that's important. In conclusion, our case provides two things that opening government doesn't. The first is that we're able to provide a world in which individuals or the education system is able to incorporate the history of post-conflict state, where we're able to instill nationalism. We've tried this through sports, where it has the ability to bring different individuals together. We also do think that even in education, during the formidable years, where a child is still learning about many different things, we ought to instill the principles of nationalism. I've never been proud to oppose this motion.
I thank that speaker for their speech, and now call upon the member of government to open the back half of this debate.
So I think from both opening teams, you hear very different conceptions of nationalism that we will concede could probably both exist. We think it's probably true that you could theoretically have a positive form of nationalism that emphasizes tolerance and multiculturalism, like the Rainbow Nation narrative that O talks about. But unlike OG, we're going to explain why this particular type of nationalism is structurally unlikely to exist, and when it does exist, it's likely to be diluted in ways that still make it harmful. So the first thing I want to talk about in our extension is the question of who holds power within these states and the role that it has within education. So this is like relatively simple, but is a contingent part of all of opening government's impacts. So education systems are government run and controlled by individual people on the basis of their political power. And after conflict, often it's the case that one side of the conflict has disproportionate power, either because they were the victor of that conflict and got to set up the government in a way that suited their interest. It's unlikely that if you just won a civil war, you're going to set up a government in a way that like gives power to the people you were just fighting. Or because in the case of partition, like for example, India, Pakistan, or North, South Sudan, or even like the Koreas, you've already divided people that were on either side of a conflict such that they hold, like the people that were fighting one side hold an overwhelming majority within the states that they govern. What this means is that these particular groups that have no interest in framing nationalism in a way that makes them look bad or suggesting wrongdoing on their part are the ones that get to decide how this narrative exists and is taught to people, which is the reason why you're much more likely to have a narrative like opening government's narrative than opening opposition's narrative. Like if I was responsible for fighting for one side of a conflict, the idea that people will question my motives or see that I did wrong means I personally stand a risk of being ousted, which creates systemic incentives to deny wrongdoing, even if it's at the exclusion of minority groups. For example, the people that like the conflicts that happened literally just happened, and the people that were fighting them are still in political power right now. They're the people that are harmed the most. So, for example, if I was, I don't know, Henry Kissinger and I was just doing bad things in, Vietnam, let's say, I don't want to be sent to The Hague, which means that, I don't know, telling people that I did genocide is unlikely to be something that I'm ever structurally incentivized to do, which leads to denialism. Given these incentives, nationalism acts as a vector for indoctrination. So when it is normalized and supported for education to be revisionist or biased, even in a positive way, it's much easier to get away with pernicious forms of ethno-nationalism that otherwise would be much harder to exist. We would say that having a norm that education should always be non-biased, that it should not play any indoctrinating role whatsoever, makes it much easier to call it any sort of indoctrination and stand up to powerful people when they try to leverage the education system to give themselves more political and political power, essentially. The fact that people often themselves were fighting for these specific ethnic backgrounds, for example, makes cultural erasure incentivized, because that was part of the goal of the people that are now in power. So if I was like an Indonesian that was literally now in power, and part of my conflict was doing sort of like, I don't know, like fighting for a particular ethnicity, it can be like something that I just already want to do in the first place, to like erase someone's language, and you get someone like, I don't know, Indonesia teaching a minority language that has now erased tons of other existing languages there before. Sure, I'll take a point.
You guys haven't discharged your burden because you still haven't analyzed to us why nationalistic values are impossible to achieve through the education system. That's your only burden in today's debate as government, and you still haven't discharged that burden.
So the education system doesn't just poof out of thin air, right? Like it's created by governments that come from a certain place that have certain structural incentives, which means you can't just assert that we're going to get the optimal form of nationalism. You have to engage with political realities that will shape what this nationalism is likely to look like. Even if it's the case that you can fiat in your type of nationalism in the short term, it's definitely not the case that you can assert that it will be the case indefinitely, which means as specific groups of people come into power, they can co-opt it. So maybe you'll have a perfect view of nationalism in India like post-conflict, and then Modi gets into power and can co-opt it immediately, right? I think it's like, even if you get that, it's unlikely that it lasts for a very long time. Okay, so second thing is just historical context, which is that the most salient aspect of modern history was often the conflict that you just had that you're now post. So like for Israel, wars with Palestine, or for Pakistan, conflict with India. And consider just like for a second the role that independence or warfare plays in the teaching of nationalisms. Like Independence Days are the most important nationalist dates in tons of countries around the world, or the role in general that conflict plays in demonstrating national values for countries. Like the US can talk about defeating the Nazis in World War II to show both strength and moral superiority, right? So in itself, since nationalism, even at its best, still requires positive views of a country, there's a degree of denialism that to get away with, like, I don't know, to show positive values. Like the US will still teach they were justified in their wars in Vietnam to this day, and even tell people that they were successful in achieving those goals so that they look strong and morally superior to the people that they're teaching nationalism to, as sort of an intrinsic part of the way nationalism works. The reason this is significant is threefold. So firstly, because as we said, the people that fought these conflicts are now in power, they have incentives to cover up genocide, to make sure that they don't look bad so they're not ousted. But secondly, because conflict is often with like ethnic minorities that still exist within the country. So when I define my sense of nationalism because of an independence war that I just fought with like India or Pakistan or something like that, it makes it very easy to then justify those things based on things like ethnic conflicts that were often a driving factor for those conflicts in the first place, that furthers the ethnic tensions internally. Because when I define my country in opposition to another country and that country's people, it becomes a lot easier to hate people of that same background within my own country. So you see things like, as you like, I don't know, drive up tensions between India and Pakistan, ethnic tensions between minorities that are reflective of the other country within both countries that lead to like massive amounts of violence towards people that are like victims of that. Since the conflict is often like the driving force in teaching nationalism, you're tied to that conflict, future versions of that same conflict become likely. So when I, see like Israel's existence as like oppositional to Pakistan, and it's Palestine, sorry, P's are confusing me. and like they sort of have like this nationalist incentive to continue that conflict, it makes it much more easy to, in the future, justify that conflict. And since we've just been indoctrinating to people to believe that we've historically been morally justified and successful in all of our conflict, it's very easy to like vote for that and to go to war again because you think that your country is morally superior and likely to be successful. So the United States, even this happens in the United States even, where because we like, I don't know, look at like World War II and that's hyped up in our schools, we think America can like bring democracy to the Middle East and they're going to be successful, even though it's much more likely to be another Vietnam that like costs tons of money and kills hundreds of thousands of civilians, right? So that's like the structural reason why I think you get much more likelihood of violence. Yeah, so I think we get more violence and destruction culture on our side for structural reasons that were never heard in opening half. I think the refutation is generally that you can still teach history, but a narrative that gives people in power the ability to erase things to suit their needs, to construct a version of nationalism that suits them, makes it much harder to get certain aspects of history taught. I think if you value teaching your history, you won't let people in charge make their like role in conflict look positive at the expense of teaching about atrocities that were committed by the current government within power or any other number of things. If you care about history, vote for like closing government.
I thank that speaker for their speech and now call upon the member of opposition to open the case for CO.
Hi, can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Sweet. Starting in 3, 2, 1. I think the one thing that all three teams have so far ignored in this debate is the idea that for a country that has just recently escaped the conflict, right, be it the former like constituent states of Yugoslavia in the 1990s or even the 2000s, sure, cultural erasure is or like, you know, lack of acknowledgement of genocide that might have happened is a serious issue. But the immediate priority is to be able to avoid war, either war within countries like civil wars, or war, you know, between your country and other countries which, for historical reasons, are, you know, opposed to you. And that means that the immediate priority is to establish unity within the country, you know, for internal reasons as well as for external reasons. In that way, I think the impacts that OG and CG bring about are not nearly as important as the ones that we're going to bring to you today. The second thing I want to point out is that, you know, there has been a huge clash between, you know, the government bench as well as opening opposition with regard to what the best case version of nationalism can look like and what the worst case version of nationalism can look like. We try to sidestep this debate, frankly, because we're going to tell you why even in the worst case scenario, the more immediate priority is to prevent external and internal conflict, and why the worst case version of nationalism is still preferable to one in which you don't have nationalism at all. And if there is uncertainty as to whether there is a best case scenario or a worst case scenario, all the more there is a reason to try and establish some sort of national identity. So let's talk about the first issue. Like, why do we need to prevent you know, external threat by, you know, looking to nationalist ideas? The reality is that the context in which post-conflict societies operate is that they often come out of conflict with other countries, right? So when a large country like Yugoslavia, for instance, breaks into like several constituent states, each of which, for example, may have some number of Muslims, some number of Serbs, some number of Croats, right? You've got Albania, Croatia, and Serbia, and frankly, like the ethnic lines, like the ethnic compositions within these countries are actually quite diverse, despite what the names of the countries may suggest. This results in a worst case version of nationalism where, you know, in a majority Muslim country, you would, you know, construct your identity around that particular religion or ethnicity to the exclusion of like your minorities in your country. That's bad. But the alternative is that other countries which also have like, you know, significant proportions of these other nationalities like Croats or Serbs in Croatia and Serbia, like are predisposed to attacking you precisely because they might have their own ethnic solidarity with like people in your country, or they might feel like they've got their own geopolitical interests in your country. And so it is imperative that whatever form of nationalism you have, you need to create some form of nationalism in order to galvanize most of your country, at the very least, if not everyone, to resist like, you know, potential invaders or people who might carve out your state, you know, in the worst case scenario. So the weighing here is that even if internal structures of nationalism can be oppressive, that is preferable to outright war, which is often far more harmful to your country as a whole and to the people living in it in terms of like loss of life and property destruction. This, I think, also directly clashes with OG's second argument about international cooperation. Sure, nationalist countries may not necessarily be inclined to cooperate internationally, but the context of post-conflict society suggests that international cooperation was never going to be there in the first place, and that your first priority should be national defense. Second argument I want to talk about, which is how you prevent civil war, right? Internal conflict. So even if certain forms of nationalism can be oppressive, that's still better than civil war. Because the best case scenario is one that opening up talks about, in which the post-conflict society that you have has no single ethnic group dominating that politics. In which case, then yes, you can create a better form of nationalism that doesn't exclude the others, because no ethnicity has enough power to do that. But in the worst case scenario, one ethnicity is dominant, like in Sri Lanka, for example, where the Sinhalese won at the expense of the Tamils in the civil war. In that particular instance, it's better to teach the minorities to respect the existing power structure, because the alternative is you fight another civil war in which you are probably going to lose again because you never had the sort of power to win it the first time in the first place. And frankly, this clashes directly with OG's first argument, because the absence of national education is not necessarily going to lead to any positive change in the tension or the conflict between like different ethnic groups within that particular country, because there is already an existing power imbalance that favors the majority. You're not going to get what you want even if you remove national education, but at the very least with national education, you can convince minorities to buy, however begrudgingly, into a particular version of nationalism or a particular version of the nation state that allows them a modicum of security and a modicum of peace, because the alternative is to fight another losing war.
POI.
I'll take you in a bit. The third thing I'm going to talk about is about the uncertainty, right? So like we've talked about the best case scenario, we've talked about the worst case scenario. In most cases, however, we're not entirely sure whether the best case or the worst case will prevail in the long run. So the weighing mechanism that we're going to introduce here is that we need to try to build a nation at some point, because at some point in time in the future, there are going to be like other national scale challenges that will emerge that will demand some sort of unity, right? So if you're going to have widespread poverty, for example, you're going to require some sort of wealth redistribution or massive infrastructural investment. All of this is going to require some form of national unity. Otherwise, you're never going to be able to marshal the political will and resources necessary to make these things happen. And I think you need to start young, as Oo rightfully points out, because otherwise it will delay the project of nation building by several decades. This is going to actually directly clash with CG, and I'll show you how in a bit, but I'm going to take a POI from OG first.
Sure. So your case is why we need national unity to avoid conflict, but we showed that teaching nationalism in schools is actively divisive and weakens institutions, which makes lapsing back into conflict more likely, because nationalism was often the cause of the civil war you're trying to avoid.
Right, I get that. So I think, there are nuances to these things. So you may have conflict internally, but there are external threats which are larger, one. Two, even if you're so focused on internal conflict, we think that teaching people to accept the status quo, however irritating it might be for minorities, is